Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Sharks' 2021 salary cap situation. So I did one of these videos last season looking forward to this season, and in that I was trying to balance potential extensions for Erik Karlsson, Joe Pavelski, Timo Meier, Kevin Labanc, trying to find what the team might look like going into the following year. I had predicted that the Sharks wouldn't be able to sign Erik Karlsson and they'd maintain most of the other pieces that they had. That would not end up being the case. The Sharks would indeed sign Erik Karlsson, and they'd end up foregoing re-signing the likes of Pavelski and Donskoy and the later acquired Gustav Nyquist. This year is actually quite different for the Sharks, considering while last year they were extremely competitive and would look to remain competitive. This year it's a bit different, considering the Sharks are currently out of a playoff spot. However, going into the 2021 season, a few things are certain, and one of those is being that the Sharks, barring any trades, will have just about $62 million locked up in 6 forwards, 4 defensemen, and a single starting goaltender of the main roster, of course. That would be Couture with $8 million for 7 years, starting with the 2021 season, so that is discounting the current year. Kane will be $7 million for another 5 years, including 2021, $6 million for Meier for 3 years, $5.625 for Hertl for another 2 years. Sorensen will be at $1.5 for 1 more year. Goodrow will be at $925,000 for another year. Erik Karlsson, $11.5 million for another 7 years. Brent Burns with $8 million for another 5 years. Vlasic, $7 million for another 6 years. Ferraro will be on an entry-level deal, but I felt the need to include him here because he'll likely be a part of a top 6 for the Sharks going into the next year at $925,000 for another couple of years. And then Martin Jones, who will likely remain the main goaltender unless something big happens, at $5.75 million for another 4 years. So as I said, $62 or so million on a projected cap of around 84. It is currently at 81.5. It should rise about $2-ish million. It could potentially rise a decent amount more than that, but also that I would say is a conservative estimate. So about $84 million, which gives the Sharks $21.7 million in terms of cap space. Now, of course, what they need to get is 6 more forwards to fill out 12, 2 more defensemen to fill out 6, and a backup goaltender to fill out the 2, and then, of course, a couple of extra forwards here or there to make a 22 or 23-man roster. In terms of free agents that the Sharks have to deal with, there's, of course, Kevin Labanc's contract up as an RFA, but he's basically the main RFA for the Sharks. There's, Antti Suomela, but I didn't feel the need to include him. And then in UFAs, there is Patrick Marleau, Melker Karlsson, Joe Thornton, Brendan Dillon, Radim Shemek, Tim Heed, as well as Aaron Dell. One thing I should also mention is that the Paul Martin buyout will finally be off the books going to next season, and so the $1.4 or so million that the Sharks were on the hook on for this season in terms of cap hit will no longer be there. So this makes it so that the Sharks actually have a decent amount of cap space, but they don't actually have much of it that needs to go towards their current free agents on the team, meaning that free agency is a very big possibility for them. So taking a look at the potential contracts that can be given to these players, Kevin Labanc, he took a bet on himself this season. He decided to take the $1 million extension for only a single year with the Sharks, likely wanted the Sharks to be able to keep the same team together to be more competitive. That ended up completely backfiring for him, not only because the Sharks were not particularly competitive, at least at the moment this season, but also because Labanc has taken a step back in terms of point production. He will be likely reaching about the 40-ish point mark, but nowhere near the 56 he managed to get last season, and more importantly, Labanc is the player with the worst plus-minus in terms of forwards for the Sharks at about a terrible minus, I believe, 19 or minus 17 at this point, which is just not a very good look. And so I suspect Labanc, he might be able to get about $3.5 or so million out of the Sharks, but I'm not so sure anymore, especially considering last year he likely could have gotten a decent amount more if he took the contract there. So maybe not the best play by Labanc's agent, as most people thought it would end up being. Next would be Patrick Marleau. Whether or not he would play another season is certainly up in the air. I have liked what I've seen from Marleau, and it does make me believe he could technically play another year, but I just don't know if that would happen. If that would be the case, he'd likely take another league minimum contract, which would come in at around $700,000 or $800,000, so of course less than $1 million. Melker Karlsson will be coming off of a $2 million contract. He does provide some great defense. The Sharks have the top penalty kill in the league, and he is a decent part of that, but his offensive production is very, very minimal. He had 16 points last year. He might not even make it to that point mark this season, so just about a dozen points for Melker Karlsson makes it so that he's basically a fourth liner, pure and pure, and so about $1 million for the defensive prowess could be expected. For Thornton, unlike with Marleau, I feel as though this could very likely be Thornton's last season. If he were to come back, it would likely be at around the league minimum mark, considering how he has been playing somewhat offensively this season as well as defensively. But I guess, anything is possible. It is Joe Thornton. He has looked better as of late from the filming of this video, but it would be a big surprise if Thornton got another year. Then Brendan Dillon, probably the biggest contract that could potentially go out to one of these Sharks players. Dillon has been rather impressive defensively for the past couple of years. Obviously, last season, he was a big plus for the Sharks. I think he was about a plus 19 as well. And this year, it hasn't been as great plus-minus wise, but he has still played some admirable defensive hockey on a pretty bad defensive team in general this season for the Sharks. However, obviously what goes against Dillon is that his point production is nowhere near what you would like a defenseman to be. And so in a top four, you don't really want to pay a lot of money to a defenseman who is only, good for maybe 20 points if you're lucky on a season. And so I suspect Dillon might get around $4 million or so, similar to what Ian Cole got when he was signed by the Avalanche. Also more of a defensive kind of guy, but can play in the top four like Dillon can. I suspect when it comes to Brendan Dillon that he likely won't be with the Sharks next season. For Shemek, this might have been a contract total that could have been higher, but because he hasn't been as great as he was last season this year, when he hasn't been injured, of course, I suspect he should come in at around $2 million. He should still find himself in the top four with Brent Burns, but that chemistry has been suspect this season, so maybe not. I do think Shemek will remain with the Sharks, however, even if he is a UFA, I do think he is a pretty important piece of this team, and so I do sincerely hope that the Sharks do get him, and I suspect it comes in at around $2 million. Tim Heed, it's possible he stays. I do actually have him in a projected lineup later on, but it really could be anybody for the Sharks here at this point, whether it's Tim Heed or someone from the AHL. It doesn't particularly matter. Heed has been okay at times this season, has been decent at times as well. And so if the Sharks want to take the chance on him, if Heed actually wants to stay in general, it could happen. $800,000, $900,000 is probably around what he would get, maybe $1 million. But it doesn't particularly matter. When it comes to Aaron Dell, his contract will likely be cut in half. He was currently making 1.9. He signed that a couple of years ago when he was, one of the best backups in the league. He has not yet been that since. And so, as I said, expected to cut his contract in about half. He'll be lucky to get about $1 million. He'll be lucky to even find himself with the Sharks if he wants to. I suspect the Sharks might actually just take a chance on one of their AHL goaltenders, or someone like Coronar, or maybe even like a Shortridge, if they wish. But, it wouldn't be too much of a risk to sign Dell for $1 million if it's just for, let's say, a year. But I suspect the Sharks could also make a move for a bigger goaltender in free agency, at least to be a potential backup challenging for starter for Jones. In terms of potential UFAs, I should say before I get into this, I know there's probably a decent amount of Sharks fans who are taking a look at how the Sharks are doing this season. They don't have a first-round pick at the end of it, and they're sort of just saying, scrap this year, go into the following year and try to get some sort of rebuild. Pull what Toronto did, be bad for a couple of years, get picks like Mitch Marner and Austin Matthews, and then try to compete. Be like the Blackhawks, they were bad for a few years, got Taves, got Kane, ended up winning 3 Stanley Cup. Be like Pittsburgh, who were bad for a few years. They got Fleury, they got Malkin, they got Crosby, they got Jordan Staal, and ended up winning a cup, and then a few years later, another couple of Stanley Cups. The problem is here for the Sharks is that you take a look at their top 5 biggest contracts. That is Couture, Kane, Karlsson, Burns, and Vlasic. These 5 players are making over half of the current salary cap, $41.5 million on $81.5 million currently. This is a huge amount. All 5 of these players are very, very unmovable, considering that going into the next year, almost all of them will be on the wrong side of 30. Only Evander Kane will be age 29, and someone like Brent Burns, in the worst case, will be age 35 going on 36 next year. So these are going to be extremely difficult contracts to move. And so if you're going to try and rebuild, you probably don't want to have these contracts, but how are you going to be able to get rid of them if you're Doug Wilson? It takes a lot of maneuvering, and it's impossible to go over in just a video at this point. And so in this salary cap video, I will be assuming that the Sharks are going to try and compete next season. Whether that will be the case is something that we're going to see, but it's going to be very, very difficult to predict what Doug Wilson will try and do this offseason. But taking a look at some of the top UFAs, you might want to target goaltending, but that might be a bit difficult. So really the easiest thing to try and do here for the Sharks is to try and get some sort of offensive depth, try and get someone to play in that top 6, because currently you have Meier, Couture, Hertl, and Kane, and then you have LeBanc, who's a bit borderline, and then you have Marlowe or Goodrow has been the basic top 6 this season for the Sharks, which is just not nearly good enough to be a playoff team. And so, obviously, the big fish here in the offseason will be Taylor Hall. He'll likely command around $11 million. We saw Panarin get about $11.5 million from the New York Rangers. Hall could likely get something just around there. Can the Sharks afford him? It's extremely unlikely. But, we saw the Sharks make a move for Erik Karlsson at $11.5, so I wouldn't doubt Doug Wilson to try and pull something like this off, but it would be very, very difficult. In a bit more of a budget realm, there is Evgeny Dadonov. He is a bit old. He's on the wrong side of 30 currently, but I suspect he'd likely get around $7.5 million. He's about a 60 to 70 point scorer in Florida. Florida is, of course, known to have all these underrated players because nobody talks about the Florida Panthers, and so he'll likely won't have too inflated of a contract, 7.5, maybe pushing $8 million. It's something that the Sharks could potentially work into their deal, but I don't think they want to sign a player who's that old. He'll likely be around 31 or even 32 going into the next year. So it might not be perfect for the Sharks, but it is an option. Pageau is someone from the Ottawa Senators. He's having a career year currently with a very bad Senators team. I feel like this is a very, very risky signing. I have him coming in at around $4 million. It's possible a team actually decides to give him more than that. But the problem is that, as I said, a career year currently for Pageau. He has never really shown himself to be at this level in the previous seasons for himself. So it's a very risky signing. I probably don't want the Sharks to go for something like this unless they can get a very affordable deal, which would probably be around $4 million. Next would be Chris Kreider with the New York Rangers. He is rumored to not be with the Rangers next season anymore, so it's unlikely, unlike someone like Dadonov, who might sign an extension with the Panthers. I doubt Kreider does with the Rangers. So he is technically a possibility. He's also a power forward, which we know that the Sharks like, but maybe you'd be overloading in that point. Meier, Kane, Hertl sort of play that style of game. But Kreider, $5.5 million, maybe $6 million he could come in at. He's about a 50-ish or so point player. Could definitely be someone for the Sharks top 6. Tyler Toffoli, another option coming from the Kings. I'm sure Sharks fans are familiar with him. Toffoli was once a 30-goal scorer a few years ago. Hasn't really gotten to that level since. He's been a bit better this season. Likely will end up with around 50 points. And so I suspect in a pretty inflated usual unrestricted free agent market, he could command around $5 million. He is a real option for the Sharks. He's someone who plays a bit more of a skill game, but with the Kings, you can't really be a Kings player without getting into a bit of the nitty-gritty. So he is still a skilled player, but can play a bit of a tougher game. And so he could be someone who could fit in on potentially a second line. And then finally, Mikael Granlund. Now, he was a very good player for the Wild, the Minnesota Wild, for a couple of years. He got traded last season at the deadline to the Nashville Predators, and he's been just awful with them. He basically did nothing for them being acquired at the deadline. He did nothing for them in the playoffs, and this season he's been quite off for the Predators, so I suspect they won't want to re-sign him. He could potentially be an option. It's a bit of a risk, obviously. Is his new level with the Predators sort of the level to come to expect, or should, in a different change of pace, maybe with a team with a lot less competition like the Predators, who have such offensive depth. He could maybe go back to shining like he was with the Minnesota Wild, who don't necessarily have the greatest offensive depth. And so the Sharks could potentially take a chance on a player like this. He has shown a very, very high level in the past, and so maybe he could work out. And I actually have Mikael Granlund in my projected lineup for a potential for the Sharks. So now this lineup was something that I didn't want to change too much of the current Sharks roster, right? Technically, I could have said, oh yeah, they could trade, Burns, and then they could also not re-sign LeBanc and acquire Hall and sign Braden Holtby and get rid of Jones. I could have put up a crazy lineup, but I tried to keep it pretty realistic, I'd say. And so I have Meier with Couture and Mikael Granlund, so potential there to just fit in onto the top six. I think Granlund would work well with those two players. Kane, Hertl, and the re-signed LeBanc, Sorensen, Goodrow, and then I have Marleau there, but Marleau, of course, can be replaced with any one of the Sharks' other rookies, likely with a small drop-off, but not a huge one, I'd say. Melker Karlsson I have re-signed, playing with Gambrell, and then Noah Gregor, again, another player who is on contract with the Sharks, but could be replaced with anyone. Someone like Suomela, could come in, Brodzinski, maybe if Chekovich, Shemilevsky, or Blickfield are actually ready for the following season, that could be an option. On defense, I have Vlasic and Karlsson, Shemek and Burns, obviously, and then Ferraro and Heed. As I said, Heed very interchangeable. And then goaltending wise, Jones and Dell. As I said, Dell also quite interchangeable. This ends up at around $79.5 million, $80 million. Then with, the few extra forwards to get up to the 23-man roster, you'll likely end up at around 82, maybe $83 million. This gives you a bit of leeway to try and make a bigger move if you wish. Maybe someone like Granlund could end up being someone like Dadonov. You could have the cap space for something like that. Or maybe if you make some sort of trade, or if you don't sign LeBanc if you want, you maybe trade LeBanc in the offseason. You could even try for someone like Taylor Hall. Maybe you could try and make a big move to try and sign, let's say, Braden Holtby and get rid of Jones if possible. There are options here for the Sharks. This is a pretty conservative estimate, but, it's not impossible for the Sharks to remain competitive. Obviously, it's a bit down this season. People are looking down at the Sharks and saying they're not a very great team, but there are still some solid pieces here. Couture, Meier, Hertl. These are players who are still quite good, and so with maybe just a few extra parts, the Sharks could get back to being competitive, or maybe we'll see some sort of rebuild happen. Class dismissed.